Community and Co-Design is the name that we gave it from the papers that came in, and Giovanna Rosen is going to be our discussant at the end, sort of thinking about co-design and co-production, something that she thinks about in her own research. So our presenters are Hernan Galpern, Sue Baines, and Marianne Gatzweiler. And so all three of those, I'll let them introduce themselves as they get started. But why don't we start with Hernan? Could you kick off our next session? Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for the invitation to present our work. My colleague Francois and I will present work that we did on Los Angeles Skid Row. And first, I want to thank both the Price Center for Social Innovation, who partly funded this research, along with the Zumberg Diversity and Inclusion Fund. So this work looks at use of mobile communication technologies among the population of Skid Row, those who are experiencing homelessness. And of course, internet access and mobile phones may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think about those who are in need of housing. But what we found is that, in fact, having a connection, a mobile connection, an internet connection, is in fact critical to those who are experiencing homelessness, because it is a means to access healthcare, contact caseworkers, and in particular create networks of social support. And all the research points to the fact that having a network of social support, in particular connection with those who are not homeless, is a critical for a pathway out of homelessness. So we delve into this issue of the patterns and the use of mobile communication technologies, in particular mobile internet, among those who are on Los Angeles Skid Row. And next slide, please, Francois. And we did essentially two things. First, we did a small survey with the Los Angeles Public Library. And the reason we partnered with Los Angeles Public Library is once a month, obviously before the pandemic, but once a month, the library brings together a lot of service providers to the main campus of the library in downtown Los Angeles. So we use this as an opportunity to, as a site for our pilot survey. So we'll be talking about the survey and component, and then my colleague Francois will be talking more about a co-design component of the project, which we did with LA CAN, which I'll let Francois talk about LA CAN in a minute. So let me tell you a little more about the survey. So it's obviously a non-random sample, so we gather around 100 respondents. But we approximated, we look at our demographics, we look at the last account demographics, and they are approximately similar, not exactly, but we think we have a rather solid sample based on the demographics, compare them to the LA last account. This was done in, again, the location was the library, and actually we did both main library and the Hollywood branch, and this was between May and October in 2018. And we sample both those who are experiencing homelessness, but also some who are low-income folks, but at risk of homelessness. So we both have people that are homeless currently, but also those who are at risk. So some of the results. First of all, we see that, interestingly, frequency of internet use is quite comparable to the US overall population. So you see on the right, the numbers for the overall US population, and on the left are sample. And you see that, so there's about 13% of folks who say they never use the internet, and that compares to 11% in the overall population. So quite similar level of use of internet, but we do see that those who are experiencing homelessness have less frequent use of the internet. And we'll talk about why the reason is that in a minute. And so one of the reasons is that consistently we find that one of the main barriers for internet and mobile phone use is the difficulty of charging the phone. So we ask how difficult it is to find a place to charge a phone, and we see that a lot of the respondents say it's either very difficult, always difficult, sometimes difficult, and the longer you've been homeless, the more severe the homelessness condition, the more likely the respondent is to say that it's always or often difficult to find a place to charge a phone. And again, this is an interesting finding because intuitively you think, well, that makes sense, because if you're living on the streets, you can't just go home and charge the phone at night, which is what most of us do. Even low-income folks who have a home, that's what they do. They go home and they charge at night. These are people who just don't have a place to charge at night. So this is one of the main barriers, and this really became the focus of our co-design project with LA CAN, the issue of charging. So we put the issue of charging within the context of what we call the access instability. So we take the housing instability and we take it to the level of the access instability for internet and mobile use. And we see that those who would tell us that they have a difficulty charging, they use the phone and internet less frequently, they have a smaller range of online activities. And this is critical. Those who say they have barriers for charging, they are less likely to report that they have a personal support network in times of need. And again, this is all the research points to how critical it is for folks on the street to have a personal support network, and particularly a support network with folks that are not homeless. So again, this became the focus of our research, and I'll turn over now to Francois, who explains more what we did in the co-design with LA CAN.
Thank you, Hernan. To do a work that was in parallel with this survey, we engaged in this co-design exercise with residents of Skid Row via collaboration with our partner, the Los Angeles Community Action Network. You see some of the members on the left here. So this was really a co-equal partnership between our group at USC and this community organization. What Hernan was highlighting, which is that people have a hard time charging their phone, was something that was really obvious on Skid Row. This is also some of the results from our survey that show that most of people who experience homelessness are reliant on public spaces for charging their phones. That's what you see in blue on the bar charts, various forms of public spaces where you can plug in your phone: public libraries, public spaces, missions, shelters, community institutions, cafe, restaurants, metro stations. What you see in green is private spaces when people have their own room. Some of them say they have a storage unit and that's where they charge their phone. And in between, the yellow is these halfway spaces, which are school, colleges, work when people have a job. So places where they can charge. But what you see here is that the majority of the charging happens in public spaces. You see on the left, this store called Body Oil, which is on 5th Street in downtown LA, which actually sells charges for $3. They will charge your phone. And when you think about it, this is an outrageous amount of money. We calculated that the cost of electricity, going back to the earlier panel, for charging a phone would add up to about 50 cents to a dollar for an entire year of charging your phones. So $3 per charge is usury. The work we did was first observation, looking at how people handle the practice of charging. You see on the top left a scene that's fairly familiar in the metro in Los Angeles, where people string extension cords and get together to charge their phones, usually at night when the traffic is lower and the police is less insistent on them moving around. On the top right, you see one of the scenes in one of the public parks in Skid Row, where people, again, bootleg electricity from wherever they can get it and run these long extension cords and get together around a table where they're charging a variety of devices: their cell phones, their battery packs, their speakers, a variety of things that they use to maintain their lives. And what you see at the bottom is what kind of public electricity is available on the street, which is usually not much. So on the left, you see a plug that's in one of the Starbucks, which has been covered by a plate because the owners of the cafe do not want people to hang out and charge their phone. On the middle, you see one that has been liberated by somebody, and you can imagine that they're using alligator clips as a way to get directly to the source of power and charge their phones. The one on the right is a picture that I took in one of the metro stations where that outlet was behind a steel door that had been pried open so that people could get access to it. So you see that there is a huge scarcity of electricity, even though the electricity is everywhere in the city, but it's always behind door, behind locks. So what we did with folks at LA CAN is to think about how can we help this. Initially, our plan was to come up with some way to provide internet access, and very quickly people told us internet access is not the problem. We can always get it somewhere by hanging out of stores that provide it or at the public library, but we just can't charge our phones. So people came up with a bunch of ideas. The co-design approach was to have 8 workshops, weekly workshops, where we got together, run a number of activities ranging from improv. We gave people pipe cleaners and various kind of supplies, cardboard, etc., to make a paper prototype of something that would help create internet access. You see at the bottom left some of the drawings of people's ideas of these carts that had solar panels, that had wind-powered machines, little places where people would put their phones. On the bottom right, you see some of the ideation sessions where we tried different logos. On the top, you see different size of batteries that we used. We bought a whole bunch of supplies, from wind turbines to various degrees of power for battery packs to solar panels of different sizes, and just try them. We essentially loaned them to our members so they would play with them, experiment with them during the week, and come back and report on what works and what doesn't. We ended up converging towards the idea of creating this cart that was solar powered, which had a battery pack in it that could be drawn by a bicycle, because bicycles are one of the main ways in which people move around the city. We tried various arrangements. One of the things that became very important in this design was to have a sound system. So you see that in the top, in the middle, big loudspeaker, an amplifier, a microphone, something that can help create some activity and call people to the charging station. It turned out we didn't really need to attract them. Many people were very interested in charging. But as a side effect, one of the results of this co-design approach was that we discovered that charging creates opportunities for education and outreach for nonprofits. It's because people come, bring their phones, and they have to be there for 20 minutes, half an hour, while they wait for the charge to take hold. And during that time, you can do all kinds of things. You can help do health education, you can do outreach, you can sign up people for programs. So it turns out to be a really interesting, an unintended consequence of doing this co-design. This is the final version of our cart that you see on the right. We ended up doing all kinds of minor improvements. You see that, for example, the deck at the top has a grid, so we can separate the phones. It turned out, as you can tell from the left picture, that very quickly, because many people bring many phones, it gets fairly chaotic and you don't necessarily remember whose phone is which when people come to pick it up. So we ended up developing practices with the Post-its that would note whose phone that was, how it was charged at the beginning, and make sure we give it back to the right person. You barely see it, but on the top of that right picture, the solar panel that recharges our battery during the expedition is hanging on one of the gates in the street. You see next to the wheel an umbrella that's in this picture folded, but it turned out that Often when it's very sunny, the phones get too hot, so we need to create some shade. I'm pointing out these details because the co-design approach was one that was essential to develop all these tweaks that we could not initially have anticipated. And there are tweaks of the technology and the way in which we deploy it, but also tweaks of the practice. So we ended up developing rules on how people use the phones, you know, sharing the power, what to do when your phone is full, you know, that became, again, very important as part of designing this experiment. Now, fast forward to this year, in May, we had to pivot because we had plans to enhance the cards, make more cards, but it turned out that one of the biggest issues that came out with COVID was hygiene. And you know, the CDC guidelines is stay home and wash your hands often, which is a great idea, but not very practical when you live on the street. The city of LA deployed those, and my timer is down, but I'll just take one more minute to finish. The city deployed these hand washing stations that didn't work very well. They were not refilled, so they didn't work for people. So we started monitoring them with LA Can and trying to figure out which ones were functional, which one were full, and which one were getting empty. And we decided to create our own hand washing stations, making them much more cheaply than the ones that the city has been buying. You can see one picture of it in the middle of this map that shows where we put the stations, and we ended up creating a whole infrastructure that provides these hand washing station that includes artists that decorated the station, that includes DIY people who made stations for us, that includes attendants on the street that take care of them, allies on the street as well, we can help them refill the stations. And so we found that the infrastructure we had put in place for the phone charging turned out to be very flexible and was also usable as a way to do other things, other kinds of infrastructures, grassroots infrastructures on the street. So just to conclude, a couple learnings, takeaways. Access instability affects internet and phone access. It also affects hygiene, opportunities for people to get what we think of as basic infrastructure, electricity, water, which is very hard to access in places like Skid Row. The recommendations that come out of our work is that there are actually a lot of low-cost, high-impact initiatives that could significantly reduce that instability. You know, again, the example of how hard it is to charge a phone is very telling because electricity is everywhere in the city. It's very cheap. Making it more accessible would make a huge difference. Making the outlets available to people would be really important. We found that our co-equal partnership with LA Can was really essential to really understand the situation on the ground and to design solutions that were appropriate. We found that art and culture was essential to success, whether it is the music that we play through the loudspeakers in the charging cart or whether it is the decoration of the hand washing stations. That is something that makes it possible for the community we're trying to serve to appropriate those infrastructure and make it feel like it's their own and people take care of them as opposed to some drab gray washing device that's brought by the city that doesn't work and that people don't really care for. And we found that there are also some very important lessons that can be applied to policy programs. In the case of phone charging, the Lifeline program that subsidizes phone access could be improved, and our paper has a number of recommendations for that. Similarly, we had a number of ideas that we passed on to the city about how they could deploy hand washing stations in better ways. And again, we're happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So, thank you for this.
Thank you, Francois.
In the slides, we've got links to two of the papers that talk about these projects and links to those of us at USC, but also Pete White at LA Can, who can connect you to the organization.
And we'll try and I put in the chat, we'll try and make those available to those of you that are are interested, there's some questions coming up on the Q&A that the panelists can look at and we can speak to at the end. And I'll turn it over to, so once Francois turns off his sharing, Sue, you'll be, there we go, you can take over.
So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me along. I wish I was actually in LA rather than here in the north of England, but that's life these days. Okay, this presentation is about social innovation in communities in connection with renewable energy. And it draws on a project that I worked on some time ago about that, but it also draws on some more recent ideas that myself and my colleague Chris Fox, who's the co-author, are working on a European project about co-creation in social innovation in various kinds of public services and asset-based approaches to doing that. Right, so the project I'm going to draw upon was called Rural Hybrid Energy and Enterprise Systems. It was part of a big international project across the UK and India, but I'm only going to talk about the UK side of it. That picture was a technical project. I was at the time working in a business school and part of a very small social science work package within a much bigger and very much a technical project. And that picture was drawn by the project leaders. And as you can see, it shows renewable technologies. The idea of making them hybrid was to join them up in interesting ways so you could collect solar power and enhance power from other sources such as gasifiers and anaerobic digesters. And in this picture, this is an engineer's picture, not a social scientist's picture. You have that the technology feeds very directly in a linear way into social impact. That's somewhat an unsubtle view, but we saw our role was to, as the social scientists in the team, was to enhance understanding of how that social impact might come about. Okay, so the ideas behind this, and we don't have a lot of time to go into depth, obviously, but in terms of social innovation, key concepts that we see as cutting across social and technical innovations would include open innovation, which other speakers have talked about, emerging from ideas that ideas for innovation are widely distributed and don't reside only in R&D departments of big companies, for example. Frugal innovation, responding to limitations of resources in interesting, creative ways. Grassroots innovation, locally responsible, responsive, looking at involving multiple stakeholders and sometimes described as niche spaces to develop new ideas, often protected from the ravages of the market to give space to develop ideas. And I've also added there, although it's not really a technological one, innovation in governance, bursting the boundary of single organizations' hold on a problem coming from public administration areas of literature. What those very different notions of innovation have in common is that they tend to expand the role of the innovator, producer and consumer in different ways, so that those roles overlap and merge. We see social innovation as often implying co-creation. I think Gary at the start talked about it being inclusive. So co-creation involving many different people, their legitimate knowledge and agency, including people who are usually seen as more likely to be on the receiving end of innovations than being part of them. Starting from a position that people have assets, strengths, skills, experience with potential, and drawing together concepts about participation, citizenship, and social capital. So those are some of the ideas that underpin our thinking about this. Right, I'm going to say a little bit about the project, because I don't have a lot of time to describe it in detail. But as I said, we were a social science team. We were tasked with finding the business models around this. I think because this was essentially an engineering project, their understanding of the social was actually framed in terms of business models. And business model literature is very interesting, and we did immerse ourselves in it. But for this paper and the thinking that we're moving on to, it isn't the most expressive and useful way of talking about communities in micro energy generation. And what we actually use is a very different framework, which we derive from international development thinking. Okay, so just that slide's just really summing up our review of what was known about community renewable energy from various studies in the UK. So the notion that community is often a term deployed rhetorically and not always very meaningfully, but that there is something real going on. There is community, these small pockets of community energy generation, and that appears to be growing. One of the things the literature often points out is the role of champions, sometimes called social entrepreneurs, in this space, who generate, coordinate, communicate, and so on. And also new kinds of organisation, multiple forms of engagement, and perhaps most key of all, a fundamental distinction between communities as targets of intervention and as active participants in them. So, the framework we have adapted in thinking about assets is called Sustainable Livelihood Framework, and it looks at, it's usually used in international development, often working with poor and ill-resourced households, but it has been expanded in various ways to study more developed economies and at different scales. But the thinking about assets is that they can be defined along these lines: human capital, skills, experience, ability to, good health, ability to work, willingness to work, and so on. Social capital probably doesn't need much explanation, but contacts, networks, and so on. Natural capital in the context of renewable energy, resources such as feedstocks, water, climate, physical capital, objects, artifacts, machines, and so on, and financial capital, also fairly self-explanatory. So that's a kind of framing for helping us to think about this. What we actually did in the project, we undertook 10 case studies of small-scale renewable energy in England and Wales. And obviously I haven't got time to talk about 10, and in the paper we talk about 2 of them in some detail. And just briefly summarize the other ones. Okay, so what did we find? Natural assets, very important. As we said, things like running water. One of the projects was a micro hydro energy project. The other was a small scale anaerobic digester, which basically takes farm waste, wet waste, mainly cow poo, and but they can also use other organic materials such as food waste, and processes that into energy. And as one of our participants said, everyone has poo, everyone has grass. That's what we do. Physical, as we said, the infrastructure, the micro hydro units, greenhouses for growing vegetables, connections to the national grid. They were working with new combinations, really, in different ways of physical and natural assets. Financial assets. Now, almost all the projects had some kind of grant income, mostly from governments, either UK government or the European Union. The one that didn't, the hydro project, we're quite proud of the fact they didn't have any public subsidy, but they did receive grants from a philanthropic organisation. And they generated income in all sorts of ways, renewable, consultancy. They had a picking litter operation where volunteers would pick litter and they would sell this service to other venues. Other assets, social networks, contacts, as one of them said. I could go in and talk at a high level to people, you know, they knew the right people, they could make the right contacts, and perhaps most of all, human capital, skills, time, commitment, activism. So, things we found from these case studies: collaborations and interdependencies, state agencies, community groups, business, almost all interlinked in various ways. Effort and skills, paid and volunteer. So the owners of the resource centre were paid as consultants, but they also put a lot of their time in free as in a voluntary basis. We certainly found people who were champions. There were strengths and weaknesses around that model because the demands were sometimes quite a strain on even people who had a lot of energy and commitment. There was definitely blurring boundaries between the roles of the innovator, the producer, and the consumer. And there was a lot of experimentation, adaptation, learning from experience. So people would literally put the technologies in, things would go wrong, and they'd bodge them and try and make them work with different amounts of success. And they also learned a lot about organising and involving different levels of community and other organisations. So, wrapping it up a bit, and the paper that I submitted unpicks this a bit more, but the sustainable livelihood analysis, it does really seem to resonate with these socio-technological versions of innovation relevant to small-scale energy in quite a rich and provocative way. Assets were of many kinds, including particularly important stakeholder relations, community action, natural and physical assets, and so on. They were working in a space where the market value of technology was often not clearly defined or widely understood. There's quite a lot of the paths weren't well trodden. They had to think and innovate and find ideas where they could. And I think human assets, hugely important, often fragile, overlapping combinations of paid and unpaid work. I think that's that really comes out most powerfully in this. There was a lot of work going on, some of it quite difficult to count or even to see, but some projects really didn't manage to come to fruition because they weren't able to put together the resources, the human resources that they would have actually needed. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. I've zipped through it rather fast because I'm conscious of time, but really happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to present our research today. It's a paper which is together with Corinna Frey-Hegge from Rotterdam and with Christine Beckmann from USC. And the title of the paper is Distributed Experimentation in Response to Grand Challenges. And there's sort of a hint in the subtitle at the empirical field in which we want to explore these distributed experimentation issues, namely in the field of global displacement. What do we mean with global displacement? Most of you who have been following the news will have noticed that there's currently around 80 million people displaced around the world. Which is the highest number since 1945. And it was also just after 1945 that the global field of the humanitarian field that deals with displacement began to professionalize. And in the decades since, that field has developed a variety of quite strong scripts in terms of how it should actually respond to displacement. And these scripts look something alike to the second picture that you can see here on the right-hand side, which is you generally house people in camps, you organize aid delivery in a relatively centralized manner, you deliver in-kind aid items mostly, which are highly standardized. And one of the challenges that the field faces at the moment is not only that there are rising numbers of displaced people, which are of course projected to further increase over the next decades due to a variety of challenges like climate change, for example, but also that these traditional solutions to displacement were designed to house people in relatively temporary shelters. But the problem is that these displacement crises are generally no longer temporary. They last on average for around 20 years. And so the field generally is in quite desperate need for innovations and for experimenting with new types of solutions. And that is generally something which is very difficult to do in a field which is dealing with some of the most vulnerable populations around the world. So we became generally interested in how this field actually experiments with new solutions, despite the fact that the stakes are incredibly high and it's very, very risky to try out something new. So we in terms of our theoretical motivation, we link with recent debates that are interested in grand challenges in organization theory. And that literature was very fruitful for us. It mainly focuses on how solutions to address grand challenges actually emerge in particular places and communities. So for example, Johanna Meyer and Mark Ventresca and colleagues have looked at how entrenched patterns of inequality and poverty are addressed and changed in local villages in India or Bangladesh, in so-called small-scale societies, as they call it. Tom Lawrence and colleagues have looked at how the North American drug epidemic was tackled in a particular local context, namely Vancouver. But of course, by their very definition, grand challenges require experimentation at scale and across various sites. And so far, not that much is known about this particular issue of how, despite the fact, as I just mentioned, these are such high-stake challenges, and how experimentation with new novel approaches can actually take place at scale and across various sites. Of course, they affect millions of people. Small mistakes can actually have sometimes disproportionate effects. And once you have actually tried out something new, undoing the change efforts that you have set in motion can actually sometimes be quite difficult to undo. So in terms of the conceptual language of how to think about distributed experimentation, Ferraro et al. In a paper in 2015 have given us quite an interesting sort of conceptual vocabulary. They define distributed experimentation as iterative action that generates small wins, promotes evolutionary learning, and increases engagement, while also allowing to abandon unsuccessful attempts along the way. And that forms a very interesting starting point for us, for our study. But both theoretically and empirically, still relatively little is known in relation to distributed experimentation challenges concerning grand challenges, which leads us to formulate our research question, which is, what are the mechanisms that enable distributed experimentation to tackle grand challenges? And as I just said, methodologically, we tackle this issue within the field of global displacement. We particularly focus on the sort of key actor within the field, UNHCR, which is the main international organization with the legal mandate for the protection of displaced populations. And we focus on UNHCR in its interactions with new actors and new practices that recently emerged, as I will talk about in the second part of the paper. So far, we have conducted 45 semi-structured interviews with UNHCR and field managers, but also with these new actors that I just mentioned. For example, private sector organizations like MasterCard and Visa, who have recently entered the field, and which is something which was absolutely unthinkable 15 years ago. We also draw from archival documents, and we followed a particular practice around which we noticed a lot of the experimentation attempts surround this practice, which is called cash-based assistance, over the last 5 years. So just to illustrate to you how this talk and discourse around experimentation, how important this became recently, this is a quote from an evaluation report from UNHCR, which tells us we made a strategic move to incorporate the word experimentation into how we describe our innovation process. However, experimenting itself doesn't need to be complicated. In the purest form, it's about trying things out in small scale. So, and this is particularly what we became interested in, how in this very difficult and high stakes field of displacement assistance, how do they try out new things? And as I just mentioned, we particularly focused on this practice, which is called cash-based assistance, which at its simplest is the replacement of in-kind standardized aid items, which are delivered in a relatively rigid way, to a slightly more flexible approach of distributing cash or voucher items to displaced populations. And this is a little sort of overview graph from a very important humanitarian organization, the World Food Programme, which received the Nobel Prize for Peace today, as I just read in the news earlier, who has actually scaled up its cash-based assistance in a period of 8 years from 10 million to 1.2 billion US dollars. So an incredible shift within a relatively rigid and conservative field within a very short period of time. And that is something that is actually representative for the broader field. It's not only in the World Food Programme, but also visible in a lot of other humanitarian organizations. So as we sort of looked at the experimentation surrounding cash-based assistance, one of the first sort of issues to address was actually how do you mobilize a field which is actually relatively conservative, which is quite entrenched, which has a lot of very well-established practices. And one of the key mobilizing mechanisms or the factors underlying the mobilization of this field was a rhetoric around empowerment, around increased autonomy and choice and free movement, which often sort of surrounded cash-based assistance, with the argument that people could possibly now leave camps, could become more economically active themselves, and could actually contribute back to host communities rather than flooding host communities with aid items from outside. That was a first sort of like rhetorical element which always surrounded cash-based assistance, which seemed to be very mobilizing and motivating for the field. And another one is shown by this little quote, which is, innovation is a driving force in the movement towards cash-based interventions. New solutions to support digital payments, access to financial services, and identity management are shaping the environment and creating new opportunities for delivering cash-based interventions. In Jordan and Lebanon, UNHCR has acquired the latest technology for biometric verification and data encryption. So this general field of possibility, which was attached to new technologies together with the use of cash-based assistance, was another factor which was very much mobilizing this rather entrenched field. This is a field which in the past has not used a lot of technology. It's a field which kind of likes to keep its feet on the ground very much. And so this talk around empowerment and this introduction of new technologies, which was actually something which was quite, I don't want to say revolutionary, but which was quite noticeable if you looked at the field for decades. And one of the implications of this mobilization was actually an increasing decentralization and some loss of control by UNHCR, which is shown by this next quote. There's obviously a global paradigm shift towards a more facilitating role for UNHCR in terms of getting others involved, and that not always UNHCR has to be in the lead. And this leads us to a second important underlying mechanism that sort of shaped distributed experimentation, which was the scaling of the experimentation space across sites, while at the same time somewhat flying under the radar not seem too threatening to the existing way of doing things. And here's a little quote from our data. We are doing cash programs in more than 60 operations already, but not in a systematic manner. So we are trying to improve the quality and trying to increase the quantity of those programs. So gradually under the radar, in more and more settings, which are very, very different from each other, in a rather unsystematic manner, experimentations were mushroomed in a sense. And this mushrooming actually involved creating a lot of new partnerships and experiments, which resulted in a more diffuse responsibility for refugees beyond UNHCR. And as I just said, this involved actors, new actors that were becoming involved in this, such as MasterCard and other private sector organizations, which previously had no business or no role to play in humanitarian assistance. So this quote here is emblematic for this. UNHCR must seize the opportunities presented by cash-based interventions. New and non-traditional partners will include financial sector experts, institutions, companies, and research bodies. The promise of cash-based interventions have also caught the imagination of private philanthropy and financial inclusion activists, creating possibilities for new partnerships and funding. So this is again something which was very new. This mushrooming of partnerships across very different contexts, involving a whole range of non-traditional partners, which sort of underpinned the distributed experimentation as we saw it. Which also links to the theme of co-design that we discuss in, of course, in the current session. And a final mechanism we label layering, which has to do with increasing the ambition of humanitarian assistance and deepening engagement in scope with the problems locally. So one of our quotes shows this. Because cash programming requires greater attention to understanding the broader economy in which needs are created and met. Its increasing use has prompted humanitarian agencies to look much more widely and deeply at places experiencing crisis. And this points to the fact that often with cash programming, much more thorough market analyses and social analyses are done, somewhat abandoning the one-size-fits-all approach that was previously established, and often leads to a much closer look in terms of how cash can be implemented, what the local conditions are for this. But I was also talking about an increase in the ambitions of what aid can potentially do. So this little diagram shows this layering process. So traditionally, aid was pretty much stuck on the left-hand side, providing basics, food, water, and shelter. Of course, aid still has to if aid is not able to fulfill these basic services, then it will fail. So whether you do cash or in-kind assistance, of course you have to fulfill these elements. But within in-kind assistance, you're pretty much stuck there. There's not much more that you can do. And what we saw is that cash was seen to enable an increasing ambition if the local conditions actually allowed it. So for example, cash-based assistance could be linked to issues of asset ownership, health and educational vouchers, for example. And if the local conditions in a particular setting will be particularly conducive, you could even expand it to include social protection, income and legal services, for example, credit and savings, work permits or legal issues. So with our study, we, so far, and this is the first time we're actually presenting the study, so we're very grateful for feedback, we identified 3 mechanisms that underpin distributed experimentation. The first one has to do with mobilizing, which had to do with the field being mobilized through new available technologies and through this increased rhetoric of market and empowerment, autonomy, choice, and free movement. The second mechanism related to mushrooming, which had to do with adopting cross-sector partnerships and bringing in new actors. And the third mechanism had to do with layering deeper into the problem if local conditions allow, layering of services, the adaptation to local needs, an increasing adaptation to local needs, and making the nature of humanitarian assistance more ambitious and becoming more development oriented actually in the long run. So in terms of what we want to do with this study is we want to build a model that examines the dynamics of distributed experimentation in response to grand challenges, particularly by identifying these mechanisms of experimentation. In terms of speaking back to the literature in org theory on grand challenges, we want to push beyond the literature on the locally bounded places and communities and complement this literature basically. And in terms of speaking back to practice, we also give some suggestions on how experimentation with cash-based assistance could gradually transform the nature of humanitarian aid towards becoming slightly more development-oriented and making these boundaries between aid and development work slightly more fuzzy than before. Yeah, so we're very grateful for any feedback. And yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Terrific. Thank you, Marian. All right. And Giovanna, we're turn it over to you. We're doing reasonably well on our time. Thank you, everybody, for being close.
So hi, everyone. My name is Giovanna Rosen. I'm an assistant professor of public policy at Rutgers Camden and what I like to call a Price Center alum. I'm happy to discuss 3 really interesting pieces of research that tackle questions of community and co-design in different ways. And this diversity really reflects the field, the state of the field in social innovation, where community and public involvement are widely acknowledged to be very important, but the goals and nature of participation can vary quite dramatically. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about participatory goals in social innovation, then transition to thinking about how these papers fit into and advance our thinking around participatory processes in social innovation. So first, why do we talk about topics like community and co-design and participation in general, and how do these processes fit into social innovation, and why are they important? So a social innovation focuses on tackling social problems, from large wicked problems to more narrowly focused issues. It's important to consider how we ensure that effective stakeholders, communities, and people are deeply involved in social problem solving. So viewed from a co-production framework where communities participate in developing and implementing solutions to issues that affect them, participation can promote 3 related ends. First, participation can create more effective solutions by incorporating community knowledge. And so we saw this, for example, with the solar power cart. Residents often have developed effective solutions or tools to deal with social issues or have important insight into how to design effective programs that will work and be used within the local context. Second, inclusive participation can enable innovation to emerge across sectors to build dynamic and collaborative solutions when necessary. And finally, participation can ensure that we do not perpetuate a history of harmful social policy by either excluding communities from participating altogether or by preventing them from influentially participating in local decision making. And so participation is undertaken with some or all of these goals in mind. Participatory frameworks recognize that we cannot produce equitable outcomes without equitable and inclusive processes. And so for this reason, social innovation must really grapple with and consider how we foster more equitable and inclusive processes throughout the social innovation process. This is really an open question, though it builds, of course, on extensive research across the social sciences, including my home fields of urban planning and policy, regarding how participation does and should occur. So when considering the spectrum of potential participation, it's important to consider the different goals and perspectives within the social innovation field itself, which partly explains how views of participation within one field can vary so dramatically. So Tom Montgomery's 2016 paper helps us a lot here, as he identifies 2 distinct dominant paradigms within the field of social innovation, a technocratic paradigm and a democratic paradigm. First, the technocratic paradigm fundamentally fits within and therefore advances the neoliberal project of free markets, privatization, and market competition. Social innovations here aim to achieve market-oriented social benefits, particularly greater efficiency and savings as government delivers services. Social entrepreneurship and similar approaches fit within this framework in a fundamental way. In contrast, the democratic paradigm sees social innovation as a way to advance alternatives to market-based approaches. So this perspective emphasizes social justice and grassroots participation to share power across stakeholders. And therefore, the democratic paradigm, unlike the technocratic paradigm, necessitates deeper participation forms, particularly for underserved populations and with explicitly emancipatory goals. So it's really important to recognize that both paradigms can support the development of social innovations that generate meaningful social improvement, from social enterprises to novel social policy to more transformative shifts in society. However, they differ fundamentally in terms of what they suggest for participation, what stakeholder engagement is intended to deliver, and how it should occur. So from the technocratic perspective, participation is often a tool to gather information. Questions of participation frequently center on how to foster engagement, when and how much engagement is needed to generate sufficient information and improve outcomes so as to effectively create and implement an intervention. Participation often occurs around prescribed ideas, topics, or outcomes, and towards a certain end. In contrast, in the democratic paradigm, questions of participation are rooted in a more co-productive, collaborative, and mutually generative approach. The conversation centers on how to build new, inclusive, and democratic spaces, dismantle entrenched power structures, and transform social relations. Participation here will look very different. Less so engagement around prescribed spaces, but rather deeper and more enduring participatory forums, which necessitate a greater time and resource investment, which we must recognize might not always be possible within existing frameworks. And so how do these different perspectives relate to the papers that we just heard? So for both Baines and Fox and Gatzweiler and his colleagues, they show us the value of social experimentation formats that incorporate local or community knowledge as a way to generate novel solutions. So for Baines and Fox here, they incorporate sustainable livelihood analysis frameworks into social innovation. And this is really interesting. They build on Amartya Sen's capabilities approach. The framework And this framework views the different financial, social, human, and other forms of capital available to individuals or households as assets that shape their individual capabilities, what Sen might call effective freedom, to pursue their well-being. And the framework is really instructive for helping us think about the assets and capabilities that people have, which shape their possibilities. And by bridging asset deficits that individuals, communities, or organizations face, including financial asset deficits, they can help give people the space to innovate. And in this case, farmers looking to develop sustainable energy sources. Rather than viewing farmers as solely consumers of energy, with government as a deliverer of services, this approach flips the framework to support grassroots social innovation, using government resources to bolster the existing assets that people have. So overall, this perspective offers possibilities for helping us understand how actors can pursue social innovation, what barriers they might face in their pursuit to enable social innovations to develop. And so this is really interesting to me. However, Amartya Sen's theory focuses heavily on individualistic concerns and the promotion of individual freedom. And he's faced critique in the past for leading us to overlook important community and society level characteristics, such as the role played by social structures, norms, and institutions. So my question for you is this something you've considered? And if so, how have you included these dimensions of the broader context within your model? Because I think it's really important for social innovation and a really intriguing question. Next, we have Gatzweiler and his colleagues, who discussed the potential for distributive social experimentation to address grand social challenges, to tackle the inherent difficulties in studying and evaluating across contexts. So it builds in piloting, iteration, and social experimentation as a means to learn and evaluate. This is really important because cash-based assistance is a growing potential policy tool to ensure that we support people's basic resources for survival. And it's intriguing and critically important to think about how we do this and how we do it well across different jurisdictions, including sovereign countries. I noticed a comment in the chat about this, and I thought it was right on that we have to think about this across context, right? And it's also important to engage in careful methodologies like they have, since this work faces inherent scale challenges. So we're studying a global organization, the UN, and specifically the Refugee Committee, while focusing on populations, refugees, forcibly displaced communities, and stateless people that are inherently shaped by forces across these scales, from national to regional to even hyper-local issues. And so to date, the authors have focused on understanding the perspectives of institutional actors, which makes sense to study the barriers and opportunities for understanding social experimentation and building out cash-based assistance programs. However, my question for you is this: social experimentation by institutions with strong power asymmetries, and this is a fundamental issue, right? So engaging in social experimentation by institutions with strong power asymmetries and really makes us confront these important ethical and practical challenges, particularly when these undertakings are done by organizations such as the UN and with vulnerable populations such as refugees dependent on agency resources. So given this, it seems critical that you engage with grassroots actors and affected populations as you understand the impacts of social experimentation. So I'm just interested to understand how you plan to address this in the future. And then finally, Galperin and his colleagues take a markedly different approach. So the authors use action research methods, including a series of co-design workshops to study mobile phone usage among people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles. Action research methods are fundamentally designed to achieve democratic ends, both through partnership with local organizations and deep involvement with affected populations, and the authors have done both here. Their methods and deep engagement allow them to generate new insights into the nuances of this social phenomenon. In particular, they show us how unstable access to a safe and reliable place to charge devices, which is what they call access instability, restricts and alters how people use their devices, creating stress and even shaping their daily activities, as the search for a device charge and internet access becomes, in their words, part of everyday life. Their co-design research approach was integral to generating new insights into the digital divide. In addition, by deeply engaging with affected populations, they were able to create a dynamic solution, which they described a lot in their participation. It was really interesting to see. A piloted solar charge cart to bridge the access divide. For social innovation, they show us how, even if we have a narrowly focused issue at hand, that in many ways reflects a technocratic paradigm, right? The issue of internet access is so deeply tied to housing instability. However, democratic approaches to social innovation that build inclusion and engagement can promote more effective and unanticipated social innovations by building on local knowledge. So I really enjoyed your paper and your co-production efforts, and I think we all really enjoyed your presentation. It made me wonder though, how do we know when we've gone far enough in co-production? You talked about this a little bit in your presentation, but I'm interested to know how have you continued your community involvement as the experiment continues, and why or why not, and what are the barriers to this work? And so the first three questions are the ones that I already discussed for the panelists, but these papers also raise a final and fourth question for me, which is directed to all the panelists. So thinking about the different partners involved in this work, they range from a local nonprofit in LA to the United Nations, so vastly different scales, right? I'm wondering if you think that the different positionalities, missions, and resources of institutions alter how they can and should engage in co-productive processes. So I'm really interested in your thoughts. Thank you so much for sharing your work with all of us. I really appreciate it. And I think it sparked a lot of really interesting questions for all of us.
Terrific. Thank you, Giovanna. We have your questions here, which I think are terrific. And we also had a question in the Q&A that came up for Hernan and Francois around the power divide and sort of really understanding whether was this the essential problem that needed to be solved. So do we want to let Francois and Hernan sort of answer that question as well as anything here from Giovanna as a start?
Yeah, maybe I'll give it a try. Thank you so much. Thanks, Giovanna, for the great feedback and the questions and the chat. So Giovanna is asking, how do we know if we've gone far enough? We know we haven't. We know we've just started here, and we think of this work as a process. Really, it's a process through which we uncover obstacles as they come up, and we explore possible solutions. But it's really a process through which we both learn from one another. The academics learn from the community participants, and inversely, we're hoping that we bring some knowledge. The knowledge that we exchange, by the way, is multifaceted. So it goes from, I learned a whole lot about electricity and what size panels you need, and our partners learn quite a bit about how to use Qualtrics, since they helped us to use those to do some of those surveys. So it's learning about the tools, it's learning about the circumstances. We ended up uncovering all kinds of aspects of the practice of charging that were really interesting, and that go back to the question that people put in the Q&A, which is, do we know anything about the impact of race and age and gender? Absolutely. We found through both observations, but also through the incidental conversation that happened in the workshops. While we're tinkering with equipment, we talk about people's daily life and their experience. We found, for example, that on Skid Row, there is as we discussed, a scarcity of outlets. Those outlets are typically in the missions, in the shelters, in some of the restaurants. And each one of them, when you go there, has a line in front of it. And there is a line often 5-10 deep of people waiting to get to the outlet. And the older people, women, people with handicap, have a much harder time getting to the front of those lines. So yes, there is a tremendous impact of age, race, ability, energy to actually make it to the front of the line and get access to the electricity. So one of the efforts that we're doing is to try to see whether both through the design of the device and through the practice of bringing the device to the community, we can actually mitigate some of those issues. So thank you very much for the question.
I want to introduce my colleague Gary Painter to sort of close us out. Gary's the academic director of the center, and will sort of bring us to close and prep us for next session.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Christine, for leading us through this and also being the real leader on the overall summit that is split between today and 2 weeks from today. So the first order of business is to make sure to invite everyone back for 2 weeks from today. We look forward to seeing you for another terrific session on social movements and social enterprise. I also wanted to thank every panelist and both of the discussants for really providing great papers, and also just really powerful discussion. And so I guess I wanted us to reflect on a couple things, and it's related to something Mark said. I remember Jeff Mulgan in his 2006 piece on social innovation in the journal Innovations made this quote, and he said, the practice of social innovation back in 2006 remains roughly at the point where science was more than a century ago, where invention and innovation were left to the enthusiasm and energy of determined individuals like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell, who beavered away in their laboratories until the occasional eureka. Well, here we are 15 years later, and it's pretty clear to me that we have gone beyond the individual social entrepreneur who's sitting in a lab or sitting in the office or sitting even in the community who's just trying to figure something out on her or his own, and then trying to sell the idea to somebody, sell the idea to venture philanthropists, sell the idea to a government, etc. And what we really saw here, at least in my view today, was how critical governance structures and institutional structures are to both the ecosystem of social innovation and ultimately to the scaling and diffusion of social innovation. So whether we're talking about responsible investors, responsible innovation, or we're talking about coming up with a new complementary social innovation, or really dealing with a complex problem through a social innovation process, that we actually saw that there is a scaffolding, there is an ecosystem that is absolutely critical. And I really appreciated that in all the papers in one way or another. I think more than anything else, as we're seeing how critical these co-creative processes are for successful social innovation, we're seeing also, I think, in my view, who's not participating in those processes. And I suspect, even though many of these studies are at early stages of, or a piece of a process of social innovation, I suspect that what we're going to learn is that there is this critical trade-off between who's involved in the processes and the effectiveness and diffusion of those innovations. So I'm, again, really excited to continue to engage with the scholars who presented today, and I look forward to inviting you back in 2 weeks. So thank you, and we will see you soon.